it's my pleasure to introduce a dear friend and partner in crime. Lately, in the past couple of years, Bavly and I have been putting together with Dr. Rouge and Bishoy, who's somewhere. I thought I saw him walk in. There you go. We've been trying to work together and to put more of these conferences up. So Bavly is he's a smart man. He had double majored for his undergraduate. He has a double major from York University in history and religious education. I believe Professor Schneider was one of his professors back in the day. And then he went on to St. Vladimir's, where he got his master's.
And more of me.
Sorry? And more Professor Schneider, yes. So if you want to see how good of a student he was, talk to Professor Schneider. But he graduated, he got his MA in 2014, right? And we're very proud that he is someone from our age is finally stepping up and giving a talk. Bavly now is a chaplain at Sunnybrook, so even more reason to be proud of him. He is taking care of the sick and the ailing from all denominations, not just of the Orthodox. And he is going to give us a very pertinent talk. The paper that he's going to present is entitled "The Orthodox Concept of Salvation: Understanding the Terms from a Chaplain's Perspective." So this is a first-hand dealing right there. So Bavly, without further ado, please come up and give us your talk.
Check. Okay, this is working. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm sure we're well rested after that and well fed. First of all, I'd like to thank the St. Mark's Orthodox Fellowship for inviting me to be one of the speakers. I still don't know what's going on or how I'm speaking with these two great people here. Both teachers of mine, Dr. Bavly and Dr. Schneider. I've learned a lot from them, and I continue to learn from them, and I hope to learn from you as well by engaging with you today. So the concept of salvation. So I'll be talking a little bit about the Orthodox understanding of salvation, and then kind of talk about it from my perspective as a chaplain in a hospital. I work, as Ron said, at Sunnybrook. I'm also at another hospital in Scarborough, a small community hospital, Rouge Valley Centenary. So I'm at those two places. Now I do have a handout in the back. If you don't have it, that's okay. It's just the quotes I'll be using. They'll be at the presentation, but you can get a copy if you want after. So the first slide, please. Thank you. So the Orthodox tradition, as we know it, has never restricted the concept of salvation to a single plan or a single understanding. Rather, the questions surrounding salvation and what it means to be saved rest in multiple paradigms, and we got a glimpse of that in the first talk from Dr. Bavly. Salvation is understood as communion, as illumination, as theosis, as freedom. All of these is achieved through Christ's incarnation, as we heard in the first talk, and his life, his sacrifice, as we got to know what sacrifice is, and his teachings, the church, and the work of the Spirit. The Orthodox tradition can define salvation and understand it through many paradigms, but the guiding principle, the conclusion, is Christ. Understanding who Christ is crucial to understanding salvation. We've had councils that lay the foundation about Christ and who he is. Scriptures speak about Christ and his life. The works of the early Christian writers, the development of liturgy, about icons, all focus on Christ as they try to explain to us in a dynamic way who he is and what he has done for us. As the centuries went on and new developments in society and culture take place, understanding salvation and its role within the public life drastically began to change and to adapt, as we kind of got a glimpse of that in the first talk, right? So next slide, please. Metropolitan Callisto Swear, an Orthodox bishop out in the UK, said the following regarding this change of understanding salvation. Where Orthodoxy sees chiefly Christ the victor, the Latin medieval and post-medieval West sees chiefly Christ as the victim. While Orthodoxy interprets the crucifixion primarily as an act of triumphant victory over the powers of evil, the West, particularly since the time of Anselm of Canterbury, and by the way, I chose this not knowing what Dr. Rouge was talking about, has tended rather to think of the cross in penal and jurisdictional terms as an act of sanctification or substitution designed to procreate the wrath of an angry father. In the West, from the 1930s, there has been a revival of the patristic idea of the Christus Victor, alike in theology and spirituality and art, and the Orthodox naturally happy that this should be so. So that's taken from his book, The Orthodox Church, which is actually outside being sold if you are interested. Next slide, please. So, next point is, I just want to quickly lay out, what is salvation? Kind of just on a layman terms, understanding. Salvation on a very pedestrian level has been understood and viewed as the reconciliation between God and creation through the meditation of the central creation, the human being, us being the focus. Salvation is the restoration of relationships that are shattered and loose from their true character. The connection of forgiveness of sins, the loosening of the bonds of memories connected to this imagery. When you have done something wrong to another individual, you ask for forgiveness. It also entails the enlightenment and illumination. In order to heal any relationship, people have to be taught, shown how to live, how to connect and relate to each other, and relate and live with their God. Salvation is also connected with union with each other. Much scriptural and liturgical imagery about salvation is about integration and consistency in the face of division and brokenness. The work of the devil, literally the divider, shows this imagery how dividing creating division within different scriptural stories. And of course the example is Job, right? The idea of dividing Job from his creator, from God. And if you read that story, you see that battle out in different ways. Aside from the texts that speak of reconciliation of Christ, for example in Ephesians chapter 1, which sees the culmination of everything in terms of union in all things when it says, to bring unity to all things in heaven and on earth under Christ. And Colossians, which expresses Christ as the principle of unity and the reconciler of all things through the church. One of the early church fathers from the 6th century, Maximus the Confessor, understood salvation as the realization in Christ of the human vocation. He drew this understanding in a fivefold structure of the union and integration of divisions within the earthly plan, but connected also with the heavenly. In the Orthodox tradition, another important thing is the sacramental life that the church plays with how we understand salvation. Not only are we to participate in the sacraments, but we are called to live it out. The word sacrament, or as we know it, mystery, as it is used more within the Orthodox circles, is understood as referring to the union of the uncreated and created, thus making Christ himself the ultimate sacrament, as is the divine and the human church. The sacraments unite the things of the earth, bread, wine, oil, water, to the things of heaven. The church, as the place where the sacraments are taught and lived out, is the space which humanity, by the work established by Christ, work out, elaborate, and experience the foretaste of salvation. Next slide, please. So, when we speak of salvation as being a union, nowhere is more thoroughly fulfilled than in terms of theosis of the human being. The early Christian writers taught that the divine likeness is something that we strive towards. The divine likeness is the realization of the gift and the vocation placed in us with the divine image. And I won't speak too much about this because I know Dr. George already spoke about it. So the classical association with that, as you see up on the screen, with understanding this was echoed by Saint Irenaeus and was made famous by Saint Athanasius on the Incarnation in chapter 53 when he says, He, being God, became human that we, human beings, could become God. What must be made clear with this understanding, as it has become a very contentious term, and it has in the last couple of years, is that theosis nor life itself is ours by right. It is the gift of God's grace. The life that bears a likeness to the divine is completely in accord with human nature. We seek to move and become more like God in how we live, and how we communicate and interact with each other. The perfect example for theosis is Christ himself, who unites the human and divine on every level. Theosis is understood by becoming ever more Christ-like. This is what is implied when we imitate Christ, especially in the language of taking up your cross, or becoming co-crucified with him, living for and ministering to others, especially to the poor and the outcast. The first letter of John summarizes this when the writer says, "When he appears, we shall be like him." So to conclude this section, salvation, what is salvation? We can say that, to conclude, what is salvation is that it's humanity's vocation to become by grace everything that Christ is by nature. Putting it another way, our work is to participate in God's work and his will to the point where, while remaining human, so having the ability to fall, we become partakers of the characteristics of divinity itself. In that regard, through the ups and downs of life that come our way, we join the one who descended for us, who, while remaining divine, became a partaker of the characteristics of humanity, giving us permission to partake in all that is divine. And then just a little bit about, I want to speak about the human being, just for a few minutes. So the misconception within our modern Orthodox tradition has focused on humanity before the fall and humanity after the fall. So somehow we understand this as, so before the fall, humanity was a perfect being, after which humans fell into sin and ceased to be perfect. That's always been a very popular teaching within Orthodox circles. However, when we evaluate the scriptures and the teachings of the early Christian writers, there seems to be a movement from this modern understanding to a more holistic approach. Father John Baer, the Dean of St. Vladimir's and one of my teachers, illustrates in his books and in every single talk, if you ever hear him say this, he'll always say this, is that when God created humanity, the subclause, when you look at Genesis 1, God created it, it was so, and then it was good, right? There's that imagery. However, when you look at the work of the human being, first of all, he didn't create it, it was a project, right? When you read the English, it says, "Let us make." And it doesn't end with the subclause, "and it was good." Why is that? Because God's project was ongoing. It didn't end. However, the creation of humanity was a constant work which concluded when Christ became man. When Pilate looked at the people and he said, "Behold the human being," in the Gospel of John, and the work was completed, the project was completed when Christ said, "It is finished." What is finished? God's creation. So understanding the human being is vital to our modern understanding of who we are and what our role is in understanding salvation. I have a very good friend of mine, Peter Abdul-Malik, who shared a paper with me that he's written called "The Condition of Man." In it, he says, when he tries to show his readers that man is mortal by the definition of his own existence, and that we overcome this mortality by sharing in the Word, sharing in the very life of God. By embracing our humanity as human creatures, it is then that we begin to see and live out salvation and how we live with each other. With this definition now laid out, I'd like to take a look at salvation from a chaplain's perspective. So next slide, please. So a little bit about what I do. I don't tell jokes, right? Charlie Chaplain. People assume that. I don't tell jokes. Well, sometimes I do. But laughter is a good medicine, especially in hospitals. But what do? I wear many different hats. I can be a priest. I can be a pastor. On a random day, I can even be a bishop. I had a nurse once that thought I was a bishop. I can be an imam. I can be a pundit. I can be a secular humanist. I can be whatever it is I need to be for the people that I interact with. I can be a therapist. I can be a psychologist. Again, on a good day, I'm a cardiologist. Between family dynamics as they arise. Oh, I want you to pray over him. But no, I don't want you to pray. I don't have any religious background. Who are you? Why are you in here? So I find myself in a lot of different situations. So I do a lot of different things. So because families and patients, yes, thank you. Because families and patients view chaplains in a particular way and see them for one thing and one thing only, the person who will restore them from illness to health. There's this idea that when I pray over people, they'll get better, right? Even though they have stage 4 cancer and they have less than 3 months to live. A lot of people think that. I'm a miracle worker. So there's a narrow focus on the one-to-one relationship between the spiritual care therapist and the patient. However, strong voices in the last 15 years have pushed to a communal approach in providing spiritual care and support. According to these voices, neither the category of martyria, to be a witness, as emphasized by the old school teachings of chaplaincy, nor the category of diaconia, service or ministry, that is the heart of the therapeutic care, but rather the category of koinonia, community, is the proper dimension for a spiritual care therapist to operate in. We operate within a communal setting. We are there for staff, families, patients, doctors, even though they don't like us, depending on the moment. We are there for everyone and for everything. I can find myself in a moment where I'm dealing with the death of a loved one, and then I turn around and the staff members tell me how amazing their vacation was, and right away I have to, switch gears because I also have to be present for a staff member, right? We are that and more. So I hope to show that the communal approach and community is the essence of salvation within the understanding the work of a spiritual care provider. My case study, who I'll be referring to, is an individual called Viktor Frankl. He's a 20th century psychologist and a Holocaust survivor who went on to develop his own school of psychotherapy, which is called logotherapy. Logotherapy's main point is founded upon the belief that it is striving to find meaning in one's life. The most powerful, motivating, and driving force is the life of the human being, which I will unpack as we move along. So moving our attention back to the community, I'd like to unpack this imagery some more. A chaplain receives his or her own training mostly from the social sciences, making them a student of history, the arts, and different psychological school of thoughts. But above all else, the spiritual care provider is a help for the living in times of crisis. The spiritual care provider concentrates on how an individual acts to him or herself and on the relationship between the person's self and the world. In a helping relationship of true understanding, healing tendencies of self-actualization spoken in the language of the human sciences can be effective in the individual. So in theological terms, we can speak of God's creative and sustaining activity being present in the process. In relation to this, the dimension of salvation is present throughout the process. And how does that look like? Next slide, please. Sometimes we can lose sight of what is important, and that is the salvation of the human being. Viktor Frankl reminds us that it is important to assert that in theological anthropology, being human is always being something above and beyond oneself. Human existence finds its realization not only in dealing with oneself in a moving and respectful manner, but also in the dedication of oneself to another human being or to a significant cause. Spiritual care takes place not only in the church, but in all aspects of life. The paradigm to which a spiritual care provider uses can be taken from almost any context. The context that I personally work out is understanding who Christ is. The church and the understanding and the role of the church in the life of the believer is important for a spiritual care therapist to operate out of. Christology and soteriology, salvation, can play a vital role for the spiritual care therapist on the notion of the living care of God in Jesus Christ. There's a focus on illuminating the human situation under the judgment and the grace of God, with the proclamation of the gospel, with human guilt and with unconditional acceptance of God. So here is expressed in the classical terminology of spiritual care, which is the office of the keys, right? And on this on this rock I will build my church, where binding and loosing take place. Help with faith becomes a help for the living. Drawing on the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, consolation and comfort can be offered in the face of unavoidable suffering in the face of death. This idea can be less well methodized and is thus easily learned, taught, and evaluated. So competence in spiritual care in the area of salvation of Christ grows above all out of faith from one's own spirituality, allows the spiritual care provider to see the potential of salvation in the person he or she is providing care for. So Viktor Frankl speaks about his experience in suffering when he says, so it's up there on the slide, so I'll read it for you. The way in which a man accepts his life and all suffering it entails, the way he takes up his cross, gives him ample opportunity, even under the most difficult circumstances, to add a deeper meaning in his life. Of the prisoners, only a few kept their full inner liberty and attained those values which their suffering afforded. But even one such example is sufficient proof that man's inner strength may raise him above his outward fate. So his great work, Man's Search for Meaning, I highly recommend. He speaks about his experience as a Holocaust survivor and how, against all odds, they were able to make it. And he speaks about the experience of those who really struggled and took their own lives, and how he was able to persevere. And out of that, he created his own school of thought. And he speaks a lot about suffering. So, focusing more on his experience, I want to look at how the Holocaust afforded him to see and to realize his own salvation. Even though it might seem that Frankl's work, Man's Search for Meaning, is about suffering, which it is also about coping spiritually during the darkest of times. If we can think of hell, whatever our greatest hell might be, for Viktor Frankl, it was the Holocaust. That was the lowest point in his life. And it shows how the spirit can affect one's fate and how it can persevere one's dignity. The spirit resides in the body. It gives it life. I have experience with many people who think spirituality is thought of as being an intellectual exercise or belonging to the realm of religious etiquette, and that is something that is something that somehow they don't have, or somehow the priest or the chaplain will endow them with. No, that's not the case at all. When I am present with a patient, not only would I pray with them and pray for them, I ask them to pray for me as well. And Frankl challenges this when he had no access to a place of worship, no access to scripture or liturgy, and came to realize his own spirituality through his own imagination in the concentration camp. He had nothing. Nothing. Even the clothes that was on him was falling off. Spirituality, then, is something that is present in the human being as being part of our DNA. Both spirit and DNA are invisible without awareness and technology. Awareness of spirituality arises out of need for it when we become desperate. Like a tree with its roots, it can keep the soil from eroding, thereby maintaining the bank on which it is growing, as well as itself. So Frankl's paradigm is focused around the human being having something to live for, something that awaits them in the future when they get there. The sick person loses faith, belief in the future when they get there. The sick person loses faith, belief in the future when faced with a poor prognosis. It is important to have gratitude for the life already lived and to live for the present, to partner the mind to the body and to the soul. A human being is wired to thrive with a promise of tomorrow, regardless of the promise that will arise to live again. If there is no possibility of tomorrow, despair sets in. Frankl touches upon this when he says, next slide please, the prisoner who had lost faith in the future, his future was doomed. With his loss of belief in the future, he also lost his spiritual hold. He let himself decline and become subject to mental and physical decay. Neither the sick person nor the spiritual care provider can accept the reality of sickness and death, and they decide to pray for recovery. The sick person asks or prays, I want to get back to the way I was before this happened. The honest question becomes, are we ever the same again? Every time we resort to wishful thinking rather than rational thinking, we lose the gates to the possibility of enlightenment because of fear and an attachment to the life that we know. Franco, as previously stated, convinces us that even if one person can succeed at meeting suffering with an inner freedom, it is enough to serve as an example that it can be done. Franco boldly states, everything can be taken from man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given circumstances, to choose one's own way, will always remain. So a sick person has a choice in how he or she will deal with their illness, their fears, and ultimately with their death. Jesus accepted his cross his own way, through inner freedom and utter trust in God. But sometimes we are just not conscious of God's availability to us. Sometimes we become like a cow, seeking greener pastures without realizing that our salvation was already laid out for us by the Master who's anticipating the new grazing place for us. A spiritual care provider realizes they minister to the body of Christ when they minister to each other, when we minister to each other. When we realize that we are ministering to Christ in all aspects of life, that is when the path of salvation is revealed to us. When each moment that we walk, that we do, becomes a realization of salvation, when the path of salvation becomes open to us. How do we realize we are ministering to Christ? Through love. Sometimes we just don't know our resources. Sometimes we just don't know our sacred text, as we found out. And the promise that God made to us. Sometimes we are under the impression that the sacred texts are irrelevant because they are written in an old language, meaning that they know of one translation of the Bible, the Quran, or the Gita, that they have never read the sacred text in a natural language. Speaking as a Christian chaplain, we are trained to know and understand the scripture from a modern perspective in order to potentially make a difference when we interact with other humans. The learning is constant for us. Theology is a way of life. And the experiences I have with people, their pain, their lack of spiritual resources, and their disconnection from God, or a meaningful existential entity such as love. I see it all the time. Father, pray for me. Pastor, pray for me. Chaplain, pray for me. And I'm always thinking about it. Franco thought about it too. While in the concentration camps, he was transformed by the power of love. This love showed him the essence of salvation when he said, next slide please. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it's set into song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. The truth that love is the ultimate and highest goal to which man can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief had to impart, which is the salvation of man is through love and in love. I understood how a man who has nothing left in this world still may know bliss, be it only for a brief moment, in the contemplation of his beloved. Even if it takes one moment in our life to realize this, then we have seen salvation, right? The greatest example is the thief on the cross. His whole life had gone without knowing about Christ, and in those moments, he saw the path to salvation. So chaplains are part of the medical team, right? Chaplains are, doctors for the soul, as Franco and his prisoners were for each other. And just as medical doctors have to be honest with their options about prognosis, so must a chaplain be truthful about spiritual concerns. It takes courage to suffer, as Vladimir says, tears bear witness that a man had courage to suffer. It is difficult to do theology by the bedside, but a theological question deserves a theological answer. If a sick person asks, how will I be saved with this body? It is worth risking a truthful response. we look at different traditions and how they deal with this. So in the Hebrew tradition, as a person continues to grow, they learn new things no matter how old they are. Within the Buddhist tradition, it is not possible to stop learning if one practices practices awareness of what is, if one is mindful. Christ's teachings are not devoid of mindfulness. He asks us to always be prepared and to be watchful, to be ready. He tells us that there are no guarantees and yet asks us to trust. Jesus encourages us to stay close to our basic existence, to not yearn for the material things of the world, but to yearn for spiritual wealth. When we are well, we have an easy time in believing in Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, whatever we might be, right? And love. It's easy for us to say that when we have nothing to worry about from a physical perspective. When we are sick, however, our life situation becomes abnormal. What we took for granted seems unattainable now. Yet it is through sickness and loss, through suffering, as Frankel illustrates, that we have an opportunity to get to know, to feel close to our God, our existence, our love, and our salvation. But because of the attachment to people, to possessions, the old self, the way of life, we cannot accept the change the illness brings, and the illness changes everything. When facing death, we panic at the thoughts of imagining the world without us in it. Yet, if we can imagine that, we can gain a freedom. An inner freedom to enjoy the world while we are in it, whatever state we are in, however long a time we have, and it is at that particular point that we come to see our salvation and the inner freedom that we have attained. To imagine the world without oneself in it is to live in peace. To see and realize the salvation, a change in attitude was needed for Frankel when he said, what was really needed was a fundamental change in our attitude toward life. We had to learn ourselves, and furthermore, we had to teach the despairing men that it did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. Life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets for each individual. These tasks, and therefore the meaning of life, differ from man to man and from moment to moment. So I had a situation where I was once paged to the intensive care unit. So I was there. I usually attend the rounds there because I'm the most critical area in the hospital. So I try to be present for them. And so there was a patient there who I had literally. This was about maybe 2-3 months ago. She just had breakfast. She looked fine. Spoke with the medical team. They said, "Oh, we're gonna move her onto the floor and then hopefully discharge." And in the afternoon on that same day, this was a Saturday, like today. I get a page and they said there's a death. So-and-so has passed. I was like, what? What are you talking about? I just saw her this morning eating breakfast. What do you mean passed? So I got there. This was at Rouge Valley in Scarborough. So I got there and she was, so the patient was Muslim. The family wasn't so much practicing, but they wanted to honor, the daughter wanted to honor her mother by having Muslim prayers anyways. So I get there, I walk in, and the first thing out of the daughter's mouth is, "I know you." I'm like, "I know you." She didn't look familiar to me. I was like, I didn't say anything, right? I was like, "Oh, okay." She's like, "Yeah, you're from Sunnybrook." I'm like, "Oh, that's not good." I remember this person. I was like, "Yeah." She's like, "You don't know me, do you?" I was like, "No, you're a nurse, right?" Just kind of threw it out there. She's like, "Yeah." I was like, "Okay, phew." So supposedly 2 weeks prior to her mother passing, we were involved with a veteran in Sunnybrook, and she was the nurse, and I didn't remember her. Anyways, so I said some prayers for her, and luckily for her, I knew some Arabic, so she was very thrilled by that, because I said a few prayers in Arabic. And anyways, I seen her 3 weeks after that at Sunnybrook, and the exchange that we had with each other was unbelievable. She's also an ICU nurse. And so when I was there, everyone was so confused, and why is she hugging this guy and whatnot. And so why I'm sharing this is because if we are able to become anything for anyone, then we do have the power to see salvation. At that particular moment at her mother's death, she needed me to be a Muslim chaplain. At Sunnybrook, I was the Christian chaplain. Because that's what I am, right? That's what I identify as. And going through that journey with her, she reminded me at Sunnybrook that her children, when they were there, the one thing that they remembered from the whole experience was the chaplain who came. And so if we have the power to connect with people, to walk in their shoes, to be on that journey, then we have the potential to see salvation. So I want to show you a video that kind of illustrates the life of a hospital and what that entails. It's not all doom and gloom in a hospital. There can be good sides to it as well. So just listen, look at the words. There's no volume or anything. So just the text is what's important. People have always asked me, where do I see or who do I talk to, or how many deaths have I been involved with today. That's a little taste of what it is that I do, right? I'm there with the person who just found out they got cancer, while at the same time I'm being paid to the labor and delivery because the family's requesting a blessing after the after the mother just delivered, going from two extremes, a very sad situation to a very happy situation, and it can be hard on us. It can be hard on all of us, but I think we all have the potential to find that human aspect within us all, whether we're a doctor, a pharmacist, a chaplain, a grocery store clerk, wherever you find yourself, a student, a mother, a father. We all have that human aspect within us to be all that and more for each other. So by way of conclusion, I have a couple more minutes, a few more points I'd like to make, and then I'll open it up for questions. I'd like to make a final few points for the need of salvation, even though this might seem like an obvious point. However, we don't need to look far into the world to realize that we human beings, first and foremost, are not well. To conclude that this worldly life is the best possible solution for humanity, to say the least, is to have no imagination and no insight into eternity. Further, we cannot lay blame for the world's ills entirely elsewhere. There is a connection between the brokenness of humanity and the evil that we see in the world, and we human beings are constantly complicit in it. When we open the first chapter of Genesis, as I've discussed earlier, we see an ordered process of creation, culminated in the project of the human being in the image and likeness of God. In the Orthodox tradition, as we've said before, right, there was never a focus on the ideal perfect state of humanity before and after the fall. And many of the early Christian writers, like Maximus, who I've alluded to Gregory, Irenaeus, Ephraim, all these writers, say that we are a work in progress, like children who acted too early on something that was meant for us at a later stage. When these same authors describe salvation as a restoration, the meaning does not lie in some historic perfect state, but rather the restoration of the will of God for humanity, united to Him in perfect freedom and love. The transgression and the eviction from paradise narrated in Genesis has never been understood as original sin in the East. In the Orthodox tradition's strong emphasis on human freedom entails that the people are guilty for their own sins. The Genesis account, specifically the first 11 chapters, laid witness to the state of the exile humanity found itself in, which was at odds with God, with each other and with the created universe, and therefore was in need of saving. The early Christian writers not only speak about the fall, but together connected with the salvation of the world. Fall and salvation go hand in hand. So taking from the early philosophers, the early Christian writers, so from Plato, they borrow a lot of their ideas, right? Elaborate on the human person being a microcosm of the created world. If the human person is a microcosm, the conclusion was reached by Athanasius, Cyril, and many others, the human being is a unique creature in both spiritual and physical, thus allowing the human to partake of the bodiless powers as well as the material creation. If microcosm, then the human person is also a mediator between the material and the spiritual, between heaven and earth. The human vocation then rests in offering all of creation up to God. All human interactions and that we deal with are constantly offered up to God. The falling down and the rising up. C.S. Lewis had a beautiful quote, which he said that, and I'm paraphrasing here, that God doesn't look at the fall of humanity, but rather at its getting back up by the hands of the community that is around them. Insofar as we fulfill our vocation, we fulfill our calling, allowing us to see beauty and to see salvation in all acts of life. Being a microcosm And the mediator is no small calling, but with the help of each other and the calling upon God as Lord, together we can make all acts an act of salvation. And lastly, I'll leave you with a quote by Carl Rogers, a 20th century psychologist, who says, and I have this hanging up in my office, and I try to apply it to every moment, every person, every interaction that I deal with. Before every session, I take a moment to remember my humanity. There is no experience that this man or woman that I cannot share with them. There is no experience that this man or woman has that I cannot share with them. No fear that I cannot understand. No suffering I cannot care about. Because I too am human. No matter how deep their wound, they do not need to be ashamed in front of me. I too am vulnerable. And because of this, I am enough. Whatever their story, they no longer need to be alone with it. This is what will allow their healing to begin. Thank you. Any questions, comments? Oh, yes.
Let me ask you personally about the experience of solitude. The reality of that pain is so personal, and death is so personal. See, we tend to share with each other through our feelings and words, which is what we are entrapped in. We cannot really experience real fellowship through our souls or spirits. We theorize that we have fellowship through the Holy Spirit. But in reality, we only are resonant parallel to each other. I'm speaking about the reality in everyday life. There is a special failure in humanity to have real fellowship. I understand the pain. We can resonate, but we cannot link really. Did anybody discuss with you this phase of your patients?
Sorry, say that last part. Did anyone
of your patients or the people you are serving discuss with you this failure?
This
Failure.
That was a lot, so I was just trying to summarize the question. And so he was mentioning, about solitude, the pain of death, and all, and if patients have shared those experiences with me, I've actually.
The pain of being alone.
Yes, the pain of being alone. So
Jesus said, "I passed this path alone. Nobody of the people of the world is with me."
Yeah.
So he's the only one who passed this path.
Yeah.
Sometimes we tend to tell people that we are with you.
Yeah.
And actually we are not.
Mm-hmm. Personally, I believe that no human being should ever be alone, and that's also in death. We speak about cancer, we speak about heart attacks, we speak about this, we speak about that. I think the greatest disease in our time is loneliness. I really do. And the greatest, if I do have a fear in life, it's one thing, to die alone. The story I shared with you with the nurse at Rouge Valley who works at Sunnybrook, so the veteran that we were involved with, you brought this back to my mind. He actually had no family, so when I went to attend to his death, he passed away. And a beautiful thing we do at Sunnybrook for our veterans is the chaplains there, we do a flag ceremony to honor them. It's a non-religious ceremony, so we do it for all of them. You don't have to have a religious background. of any kind. And that particular veteran had no family. So when I was talking to her, I remember clearly, I was like, is there a family? No. Okay. Cousins, relatives, anything? Nothing. He had a social worker in the community associated with his father. He had absolutely no family. But me and the nurse were there at the end of his life, and he wasn't alone, and we made sure he knew that. So it is probably the greatest struggle in life to be alone. And that's why I know Dr. George has his beef with monasticism. I have my beef with it for completely different reasons. I mean that, to be alone is it's a great struggle. It really is. We all have to live with each other, to be with each other. Even Christ. I don't think Christ was ever alone. He never was on the path, right? On the cross. He still had his mother and the beloved disciple and the Father. Thank you.
That last point is the key point. There is a moment when Christ is absolutely alone, and it's existential aloneness. That is, his disciples have fallen away, they have gone to sleep, and he is alone in the Garden of Gethsemane, and that's the moment when he weeps and sweats blood. But then in the actual crucifixion himself, and his realization at that point is that he's not alone, because he's speaking to the Father. And concludes, "Thy will be done." The whole crucifixion narrative is based on the 21st or 22nd Psalm. And the 22nd Psalm begins with, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Right? But, and everybody sees, because that line is repeated in the gospel story, everybody thinks that's a moment of his existential aloneness, but in fact, in good Jewish fashion, by quoting one line, he's quoting the entire psalm. And if you follow your way through the whole psalm, it ends with, even in the midst, I will glorify you. And that's what he's actually saying. So from that point of view, Jesus in Gethsemane has the same existential aloneness that we're all referring to here, and that we all know very well, I'm quite sure. But eschatologically, in relationship to faith and God, Jesus was never alone. That's the important point. I'd just like to add on a personal basis that I've known a number of people who have been with a number of people who have died. And in the Orthodox world, the best death I think I've ever encountered was a woman. She was Serb, and she had had 2 fairly miraculous remissions from cancer. And she had a 3rd relapse that got her. And she used the opportunity of her death to share it with everybody, to share her joy, to share her contentment, to share her, right? And that's because she was a very great lover.
Let's give an opportunity for other people. Anyone else?
As much as I'd love to get into this whole monasticism, you just brought up that. I'll stick with my initial question.
We can talk after.
Yeah, we'll talk about that one now. So initially, beginning of the talk, you talked about how the idea that when humans were initially created, we weren't perfect. And I believe Saint Ignatius is the one that said he believes that humans, when they were created, eventually they were supposed to eat the tree of good and knowledge of good and bad when they mature. So, and you said your professor actually speaks about this a lot, so I would love to know what you and him actually, I would love to get some elaboration in that point.
About the state
how we were actually, because we're always taught that we were created in God's image, which was perfect in the beginning.
Yeah.
But then I know Saint Ignatius had that one point where no, we were actually maturing, and you brought it up and you said you guys actually speak about that a lot. So I would love to know
your perspective. Yeah, and I mean, were you here for the first talk? Any chance?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, and I mean, the early Christian writers, the fathers, they actually point to this, where the idea is that we are created in the image, but we are constantly working towards the likeness because we have lost we had lost that part, right? Yeah, all the early Christian writers point to that, where we are constantly, that's what we are working for. We have the image of God in us. When I see you, when I see everyone, I see God in you, and that we are on this journey together, towards achieving that union, to be, on that path of salvation, on that journey. So that slowly start to...
I understand that part.
Okay.
The question is, were we in good prior to the fall? And then when our nature got corrupted, then, now we're trying to get that back to the pre-fall stand.
So he's asking about the before the fall, and if we're trying to get back to that state now, and if we weren't perfect. I don't think the imagery that the Fathers use is that we were kind of created like children, and that we had eaten from the tree a little too early. So whether that means that we were supposed to eat from the tree, I'm just using the imagery of that because that's what's there, at a later point. I mean, I don't know, but the idea is that we are now at this point where we do have this nature of ours that has been corrupted, but has been now kind of been restored through the work of Christ, through the incarnation, the salvific act of the cross and the resurrection. Yes?
Story that you gave about praying with the Muslim family.
Yes.
My question to you is, how do you relate to the respective religious denominations, and how do you meet them at their level? And how, in a sense, is that salvific for them insofar as if we were to equate salvation with truth? How is that, on the big picture, salvific with them like that? I'd like to hear your take on that.
So through our training and what we do, we are taught to meet the person at where they're at. And so in regards to the actual prayers and stuff, they do train us. We have imams or Buddhist monks or pandits who come in and they educate us and tell us what to do at time of death, or if there's a birth, etc. We have different resources in that regard. So we're equipped in that sense. You're asking about the moment, I guess, of salvation, or how this is salvific to them. And in that particular example, honest to goodness, the family wasn't even religious. The daughter told me straight up, I'm only doing this for my mother. She was a devout Muslim. Her husband, was an imam, and she just wants this done, for her sake. And that's what that meant for them at that time. So my going through that ritual of saying those prayers was the moment of salvation for them, the appreciation. So when I saw her 3 weeks after the fact, the one moment that she remembered wasn't necessarily going through the pain of losing her mother or having to deal with different family dynamics as they arose, because they always do, but rather I was there and I was able to provide that moment of peace. And that for them is the point of salvation, whatever that means for them, however they want to unpack and unfold that.
I was just going to make another comment. While you were talking, I thought of Paul when he went and found, I can't remember the city, where he found them very religious, and the city, Ephesus, and Athens, sorry, my ears are getting old.
No.
Anyway, so he did not attack them. He said, hey, I see you're very religious, you worship, whatever. Let me tell you about this God you're worshiping. Even though they were worshiping probably an idol or something, they didn't know.
Yeah.
But at least he came in, he did not condemn them at the beginning. He said, let me tell you what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And then through that, he guided them to Christ. So, you come, I guess, I don't know if there's
and I mean, the great example of that is, to the Greeks I became a Greek, to the Jew I became a Jew, right? To the atheist I become an atheist, to a Muslim I become a Muslim, to
No, he didn't say that.
to the secular humanist I become a secular humanist.
He didn't say a Muslim will become a Muslim.
Pardon me?
He didn't say
No,
this.
no, that's sorry, that's my, those are my words, sorry, not St. Paul. Yes.
I just wanted to reflect on the quote that you have up there. Because
Yes.
sometimes you can't change the situation, you can't change yourself. And I work with a lot of kids and want to change their situation, and they want to change themselves. And sometimes you can't change either, so we have to work on acceptance.
Yep, that is true, and that goes back to how people see me, right? Oh, he's the man of God. Say a prayer and they're gonna feel better. Well, let's say if they don't get better. The situation's not gonna change, and you're not gonna change. So you have to learn to accept, and that's why I find myself, I relate a lot to social workers, right? And we have to live in a world where it's not resolution based. What we do is never resolution. What we do is we meet the individual where they are and we try to journey with them. And we take that journey along with them. And wherever that ends up going is where it goes.
It's very interesting when you begin to accept it and there's actual change.
Yeah, and there's freedom in that.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Dr. Rouge?
Have you ever came across someone who was happy that he is dying?
Yes.
Oh, I'm interested in this one.
Yes, I will share with you. So he was in the Sunnybrook ICU unit, and I had connected with this individual. He was in his mid-40s. So Sunnybrook, if you don't know, is a trauma center. So we got a lot of car accidents, a lot of during the summer ATV accidents, etc. So he was actually from. I want to say he was from Peterborough, from that area, and he'd been involved in an ATV accident. And so I had met with him, and right before he got to a state where he wasn't able to communicate, I was able to communicate with him, and he kept sharing with me how, he's enjoyed his life. Life with him. He was only in his mid-40s, right? When we think of mid-40s, we think someone is young, right? And he kept telling me how, and his wife was there, didn't even say a word, his wife was smiling the entire time. I don't remember his faith background, but he was telling me how, I've lived a good life. I've enjoyed my life to the fullest. I have 3 children, my wife is there, and I don't regret any moment of it. And I know that when I die, it will be a peaceful death because I've come to accept this accident that's happened to me and what my next steps are. Full stop. And I remember when I walked out, I became very teary-eyed.
Thank you.
دكتور أبونا فيلمون المعاري
English.
Father Philemon, the St. Macarius, was very happy to die. He refused to have any company and said, I live for that moment to be alone with my beloved Jesus. It's time to gain my complete freedom. And he died.
I saw him 3 months before that.
But you are a lucky man.
He knew when he was done.
Last question, because I know we're a little behind on time, Andrew.
You describe yourself as, I believe, a physician of the soul, correct?
Yes.
The hospital setting. And that's quite clear. And we know that the hospital is quite a machine, where you work in a team of professionals and each one has a designated role, and it works rather well.
Yeah.
In the church setting, collectively referred to as a hospital on its own right. Outside of work, obviously your role doesn't end. So where do you perceive your role as a chaplain at the church? And I would also like to see what insights you have about how, despite it being called a hospital, the church that is, where are there major differences in the form of treating the soul?
Yeah.
And by extension also, as members of that church, what's our role as instruments in that machine that we call the hospital of the church?
Yeah.
And if possible as well, by extension, what's our role outside of the church as well?
Yeah, so just to kind of repeat, just to summarize what you're saying to people, if they didn't hear, so he's talking about my role in the hospital and the church also, by definition, being a hospital. How does that look like, and how do I differentiate between my roles? I think, me personally, and maybe with all of you, is that what we have to realize and understand is that our roles never really end. My role doesn't end at 7:30 after I give my report. I am constantly a chaplain, right? I'm constantly a pharmacist, a doctor. If you're a doctor off duty and someone is having a heart attack, you're not gonna be like, oh well, I'm not working, and you walk away, right? I mean, I hope you don't. Right? We are constantly immersed into that. One of the differences, though, I would make a difference, especially today in the 21st century, is that a church is a little different from a hospital because, sadly, is that we've become cultural ghettos. At least the immigration experience of the church, whether it be from Eastern Europe, from Africa, from wherever they're coming from, right? And so sometimes priests will make distinctions. Oh, he's not Catholic? I'm not going to see him. Oh, he's not Orthodox? Well, I'll make sure the other guy comes and sees him, right? Sadly, that happens. But it shouldn't be like that. And so that's where, me personally, I'm not bound by that. And I'm not bound by that outside of the hospital either when I go into a church. I don't see that. I don't see black and white, orange, yellow, Egyptian, or whatever you're from. We are all equal. We are all equal. So for me, there's no differentiation. I am who I am by extension of what I do in the hospital and outside the hospital. And we all have those moments too when we fall. If anyone's ever seen me play basketball, right? I am the biggest on the basketball court. But that's part of who I am too, right? It's how we express each other as human beings. We all have that moment of, when we get angry and stuff. But once that buzzer goes off, I'm back to whoever I am.